Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar with Celia Stahr on Frida in America, the creative awakening of a great artist. Uh, the book is a compelling, insightful, and beautifully written work. As a result, I'd like to begin in a bit of an unconventional way. Rather than a formal introduction, I'd like to begin by reading the first paragraph of the introduction to the book. To step within the blue walls of Frida Kahlo's home in Coyoacan is to enter into the artist's sanctuary. You feel Frida's spirit as soon as you walk through the rectangular vestibule and into the central courtyard, filled with green leafy plants and trees, surrounded by those deep blue walls. It's ravishing. Then the author, Celia Stahr, walks through the beautiful tiled courtyard splashed with color. She walks through Frida's studio where she painted, her father's studio where he practices art as a photographer. And then the author enters the library and writes about Frida and her father. Both were voracious readers. Uh, there is a wide variety of subjects, and the books are written in many languages: Spanish, French, German, Hebrew, and English. The books included John Steinbeck's In Dubious Battle, Jose Vasconcelos' Lógica Orgánica. And then the author continues. As I perused these titles, novelist Isabel Allende's words rang in my ears. The library is inhabited by spirits that come out of the pages at night. Actually, having read the book, I'd have to say that those spirits are in the pages that Isabel Allende writes about, are also present in the pages of Frida in America. So one more paragraph from that introduction. Frida in America is a story about the impact of place. The word America in the title refers to Frida's time living in the United States of America, but because this is a story about a Mexican artist, it's an America seen through Frida's eyes. It is both, as I mentioned, an exceptional book about an extraordinary artist, but it's also a book very timely, given the intensity and vitriol and anguish that has occurred on the border that's depicted in Frida's extraordinary painting on the cover of the book, Self-Portrait at the Border, and these themes that run through the book beyond the art itself have a particular resonance today. Celia Stahr is a professor at the University of San Francisco, where she specializes in modern and contemporary art with an emphasis on feminist art and gender studies, as well as African art. Our format today will be very straightforward. Celia Stahr will give an opening presentation, and after we will seek to answer the questions that you've sent in advance and those that you send on the Q&A during the webinar itself. We will also send a number of the questions that we don't get to because of time constraints to Celia Stahr, and her responses will be published on the website as a blog of the Center for Latin American Studies, clas.berkeley.edu. Before we begin, I want to mention uh, that we have participants in this webinar from across the United States and from throughout Mexico. In the United States, Boston, Portland, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Colorado, Illinois, Iowa, Baltimore, and Texas. Also, a great diversity of places in Mexico, from Guadalajara to Mexico City to cities in the South. Internationally, there are participants registered from Vancouver, Canada, India, Singapore, Germany, Sweden, Mexico, I mentioned, Chile, Romania, Spain, and Israel. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Celia Stahr.
Thank you so much, Harley. That was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And I also am just really honored to be here today, to be able to speak about Frida Kahlo and her experiences living in the United States, or what she called Gringolandia. So let me put on my slides. All right. I'm also really pleased to be able to speak about my book, Frida in America, at a time when the De Young Museum in San Francisco is finally able to have their Frida Kahlo Appearances Can Be Deceiving exhibition up. It was supposed to open up in March at the time when my book was coming out. And then, of course, it couldn't open up due to COVID, but it did open up recently, and I had an opportunity to see it, which was very exciting. I really loved it. And so you see here on this page now, this is from the exhibition, and I was so moved and proud to see my book in their gift store, and here it is right next to Frida's diary. So that also made me feel really good. Anyway, I will show a few slides from the exhibition. I won't really be discussing the exhibition, but I'll show some of the slides from it. Porfirio Diaz looks in the mirror and sees his brown mestizo skin. He picks up a powder puff dusted in white and begins to cover his indigenous Mixtec ancestry. For 31 years, this military general led Mexico masquerading as a light-skinned Spanish man because he wanted to make his country over into a Europe of the New World. By 1910, this ideal that had permeated the social fabric of Mexican society began to unravel with the outbreak of revolution. 20 years later, while in San Francisco, the artist Frida Kahlo looks in the mirror and sees her light brown skin. She's thankful she didn't end up with her father's German complexion, commenting, "I remember the color of my father's skin, that I did not like it." She's happy to see her mother's darker skin and powerful, deep-set eyes, accented by her maternal grandmother's conjoined eyebrows. She parts her black hair down the middle and pulls it back into a low bun. She applies lipstick, places Aztec-inspired earrings in her earlobes, and clasps an Aztec jadeite necklace around her neck. Then, over her long peasant-style skirt and blouse, she wraps her shoulders with a rebozo, that ubiquitous shawl symbolizing Mexican women of all classes. But the way she crosses the shawl over her shoulders creates the look of a soldadera, a revolutionary female soldier who wore bullet-filled bandoliers crossed in front. Sometimes when not in uniform, soldaderas wore their rebozos crossed in front to distinguish themselves as soldiers. They played a crucial role in the revolution, and their fame grew as the popular corrido La Adelita about a soldadera who fought for Francisco Madero's troops came to symbolize the revolutionary spirit. After the revolution, the name Adelita became synonymous with any woman who fought for her rights. Frida identified with Adelita and the soldaderas. And while at a Mexican restaurant in San Francisco, she belted out the song La Adelita, proclaiming to her mother, "I was a hit." Frida knew when she posed for Imogene Cunningham that by arranging her rebozo in a similar fashion to the soldaderas and wearing Aztec-inspired jewelry, that she evoked the persona of the politically engaged Mexican nationalist. For Frida, who was still coming into her own as a 23-year-old woman, that identity was bound up with the image of the strong, independent, and at times cross-dressing soldaderas. Frida would soon start creating self-portraits that foregrounded her strength as well. This is what struck me the first time I saw Self-Portrait with Monkey, a fierce warrior with black hair pulled back tightly, showing off a prominent forehead, akin to an Aztec warrior, and a bird-like unibrow above intense brown eyes. A black spider monkey perched on her shoulder places its paw around this warrior's neck in a protective yet menacing pose that has the potential to strangle her as it clutches a red ribbon that loops around her neck and the monkey's. Yet Frida, the warrior, doesn't look fearful. This woman radiates power. She's proud of her brown skin and jet black eyebrows, as well as her facial hair just above and below her lips. Standing in front of a dense field of dark green leaves, her red hair ribbon and yellow shirt position her as a very different kind of woman in nature, a theme I'd seen previously in art, but which looked really different. Frida doesn't stand nude in nature with an ethereal look on her face. She doesn't lie nude out in nature. Nor does she have a mask-like face as in Paula Modersohn-Becker's Self-Portrait with Amber Necklace. In some ways, she has the strong gaze and connection to nature of Leonardo's Mona Lisa. But Frida makes her connection to nature even stronger with the integration of the leaves, the monkey, and the warrior. Just look at the warrior and the monkey. They are one and the same. They command this painting. At the time I encountered this image, I was an undergraduate college student at San Francisco State, sitting in one of my first art history classes, and I had never heard of Frida Kahlo. I had just returned from a 3.5-month trip to East Africa, and before that, a trip to Mexico, and I was questioning what to do with my life. In that darkened art history lecture hall, when Professor Whitney Chadwick clicked the slide projector to advance to this painting of a fierce woman and her spider monkey, all the cliches you can imagine happened at once. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't stop staring. I just had to know who made this painting. I really couldn't get this image of Frida out of my head. So I wrote my first art history paper on this then little known Mexican painter, at least little known in the United States. But at the time, Hayden Herrera had recently published her groundbreaking biography and was promoting it by making the rounds on college campuses. I was overjoyed when I saw she was coming to San Francisco State. The more I learned about Frida, the more I wanted to know. I became immersed in my research for this art history paper and in the world of Frida. Just as traveling to East Africa and Mexico had opened me up to new ways of seeing the world, Frida Kahlo's Self-Portrait with Monkey helped to change my path in life. I decided to study art history in graduate school. Now, as most of you are probably aware, throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Frida's popularity grew more and more as people discovered the incredible art and life of this Mexican woman who was a trailblazer in so many ways. She was a radical in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s because she defied gender and racial stereotypes, both in her life and her paintings. More and more books and articles were written, exhibitions were mounted, movies were made, and the merchandise kept coming. By the end of the 1990s, Frida had become famous, and I had begun to focus on other artists. I never stopped loving Frida's paintings, but I tucked her away while working on my PhD. But Frida wouldn't let go of me. In 2007, now teaching at the University of San Francisco, I had the opportunity to present a paper for a conference that featured women artists working between the two world wars. As I pondered which artist I'd like to focus on, I realized that all the artists I'd ever read about from the interwar period were white Europeans. My interest had always been cross-cultural, so I thought Frida would be a fascinating artist because she was Mexican, yet she was in the United States between 1930 and 1933, a period that was instrumental in her development as an artist and the creation of her persona as a provocateur. Certainly scholars had discussed her important breakthrough paintings while in Detroit, such as Henry Ford Hospital and My Birth. But a fuller understanding of her creative process, which led to these breakthroughs, and her complex reactions to what she experienced in San Francisco, Detroit, and New York were missing. We knew a lot about her mature style, but not as much about her development as an artist. Now, how did she get from two women seen on the left to the two Fridas painted 10 years later in 1939? Or how did she get from two women to Portrait of Ava Frederick? Or Portrait of Mrs. Jean White to Portrait of Luther Burbank, both created in San Francisco, but only 3 months apart? Now, Frida's portrait of Jean White is a well-constructed, lovely painting of this woman who, with her husband, Clifford White, lived in the same building as Frida and her husband, muralist Diego Rivera. They lived at 716 Montgomery Street. Now, with Jean's portrait, Frida combines aspects of a style she'd been working on in Mexico, which was inspired by colonial style paintings and retablos, these small paintings created on tin that were made by local artisans and sold in the markets. They often have inscriptions as seen on the far left, and in this case, it's giving thanks to Jesus for saving a loved one from death. Now, in Frida's case, the inscription for her portrait here identifies the sitter, the month and year it was painted, the city where it was painted, and the artist's name. But when looking at the center painting by Bustos, we can see how Frida has borrowed elements as well, such as the green curtain, the visible back of the chair, and the strong gaze. Elements you can actually zero in on if you do attend the de Young exhibition, as this portrait of Mrs. Jean White is in the exhibition. Now, Frida had been working on some of these symbols, though, before she came to San Francisco, as we can see in her self-portrait, Time Flies, in the center. This self-portrait was made shortly after she married Diego Rivera. She sets herself up as a woman of the people with her simple white top and Aztec jadeite necklace. The airplane above connects her to the changing modern world just outside her window. When she made the painting of Jean in San Francisco, she borrowed the green curtain with red tieback and the chair from the artist, as we see on the left in Bustos's painting. Jean, therefore, is a modern woman who sits in an interior setting coming out of Mexican-style paintings, but with a San Francisco cityscape behind her. This was the type of cross-cultural style Frida was working with in San Francisco. She had attempted some self-portraits, but she wasn't happy with them. One she did like was this self-portrait that she created alongside Diego. And this painting, which is called Frida and Diego Rivera, is owned by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, but it is now hanging in the de Young exhibition. In this painting, Frida conveys some important differences between husband and wife. Diego stands tall, his feet firmly planted on the ground, with his brushes and palette in hand, next to Frida, who tilts her head toward her husband, as if to convey her deference to the maestro. Most authors see the painting as an example of Frida as the wife to a larger-than-life artist, and it is surmised that Frida really didn't see herself as an artist in this early stage. But details matter when it comes to Frida's art. In terms of color, Frida's vibrant red rebozo hugging her shoulders and hanging down in front of her green dress stands out. It catches the eye. It draws our attention to this Mexican woman who we learn from the banner above is the artist who created this painting for Albert Bender, one of the most important art patrons in the Bay Area. It was a smart move on Frida's part, as he loaned this painting to many exhibitions until 1935, when he donated it to the newly created San Francisco Museum of Art, now SF MoMA. The fact that Frida made this painting for Bender and placed the information in the ribbon above made me think that Frida was more ambitious than most people thought. When I began reading through the hundreds of letters that Frida wrote home to family and friends, I discovered that my hunch was correct. Frida was ambitious. She wrote to her mother on December 4th, 1930, less than 1 month after arriving in San Francisco, quote, "I am painting because they want me to have an exhibition before we go. It's a good opportunity for me to sell some things and help you more. And if I lose this chance, I will kick myself. Don't you agree? We will probably move to a hotel so I can paint all day instead of spending my time sweeping floors and stupid stuff like that," end quote. Although Frida and Diego did not move out of the artist's flat they shared with other artists at the 716 Montgomery Street flat, a couple of weeks later, Frida told her mother, quote, "I'm painting quite a lot, almost all day long." By early February, she reported, quote, "I've done 6 paintings already and people have liked them quite a bit," end quote. Now, while Frida's marriage portrait may seem to some to be a statement of her subordinate role within her marriage, if we look at an earlier drawing she made when she first arrived in San Francisco, and we look more closely at the placement of Frida's hand in her painting, the issue of power begins to shift. In the drawing, Frida's hand is submerged under Diego's. In the painting, Frida's hand is on top. She has more control. This hand gesture, in conjunction with her choice of colors, the words she placed in the banner above, and the clothing and jewelry she wears, are significant. I wanted to know more about Frida's creative development while living in San Francisco. I'd read that she turned heads while walking down the street, wearing her beautiful, colorful outfits like the one seen here, but that didn't tell me anything about the impact San Francisco had on Frida. What I discovered was that Frida's independent spirit was championed by her fellow female artists, Lucille Blanche, who lived downstairs from Frida, and Pele Delap, a young art student at the California School of Fine Arts, known today as the San Francisco Art Institute. They would gather together at Lucille's studio and create drawings, either separately or together. When they did it together, they would pass a piece of paper around and make a composite drawing. Other times, they'd choose a theme like maternity, and each would draw their own version, as seen in Pele's drawing right here, which, as she states, we're looking at, quote, "a voluptuous woman with flowing red hair and 5 breasts, nursing 5 babies of different races." Whatever they drew, it had a, quote, "witty, wicked touch," according to Pele. For Frida, this meant including blood, saying in English, "Let's draw the bloodiest thing we can think of." I realized that these nights of creative experimentation led to one of Frida's first major breakthroughs in style. The balanced and lovely cross-cultural portraits Frida had been creating in San Francisco, like the one of Jean, suddenly changed in style with Portrait of Luther Burbank, a well-known botanist and horticulturist who became famous for his hybrid fruits, vegetables, flowers, and trees. Luther's life's work clearly inspired Frida to deviate from her style and create the man as a hybrid, part human, part tree. Gone are the obvious symbols of Mexican colonial paintings and retablos, the curtain, the wooden chair, the scroll. But Mexican and Aztec notions of the interconnectedness of life and death certainly informed this innovative painting. And she's incorporated blood. Frida and Diego visited Burbank's house in Santa Rosa, California. And while Luther had died in 1926, his widow Elizabeth still lived in the house. They had the opportunity to see and experience Luther's beloved gardens, including the huge cedar of Lebanon tree seen here. Luther was buried under it. Frida places Luther's skeleton under the ground, and with blood still coursing through it, it nourishes the roots of the tree, which sustains the man tree above. Luther's life's work and his burial place obviously inspired Frida. But again, the idea to create a hybrid, a man tree, would have seemed natural due to images of Aztec hybrid human plant deities or Day of the Dead skeletons with trees, flowers, and cacti growing from the bones of a skeleton. Clearly, living in San Francisco and visiting Burbank's home in Santa Rosa had a big impact on Frida as a person and an artist. She was painting a lot and thinking about having an exhibition. Yet most would say Frida disliked what she called Gringolandia. And this is true, but it's a bit too simplistic. Yes, she disliked aspects of the United States, hated the injustices she witnessed, but she also found San Francisco to be a beautiful city surrounded by water. She marveled at Chinatown. She loved the Metropolitan Museum in New York, got a kick out of American movies and actresses such as Mae West, or actors such as Charlie Chaplin. In Detroit, the industrial capital, she found its industries interesting. I wanted to understand more fully what it was that Frida disliked and what it was she liked. What had the most impact, either in a positive or a negative way? Now, when discussing Frida's time in the United States, understandably, scholars tend to focus on these two breakthrough paintings because they foreground Frida's physical and emotional pain, a subject that's emphasized in the literature on the artist. But she also created two of her most politically charged paintings: Self-Portrait on the Borderline between Mexico and the United States on the left, created in Detroit, and My Dress Hangs There, seen on the right, created in New York. Both of these paintings are filled with images that are difficult to decipher in a reproduction. There were many objects I noticed once I'd seen the paintings in person in 2008. For example, in My Dress Hangs There, in reproductions, I'd certainly seen the collaged images that are placed right here in the foreground. Here's a close-up of this portion, and then another close-up here. And so I'd seen these collaged images that were taken from newspaper clippings. I had even read about these are connected to the economic depression with people in breadlines. But when I saw the painting in person, there were three signs that jumped out at me just left of the bridge. And that's where you can see over here. So one, which is right here, says "Smash Scottsboro Frame Up." Another one here says "Negro White." And then this one here says "Negro and White Dressmaker on the Picket Lines." Now, this painting, My Dress Hangs There, is hanging right now at the de Young Museum. So if you have a chance and you go to the exhibit, look closely at these signs because you could easily miss them. And this is typical of Frida's work. There are important details to decipher for those, at least like me, who have a detective's spirit, right? I wanted to know why Frida had included these signs. They were taken from newspapers, so she was making a choice as to which photos to cut out and collage into her painting. The reference to a dressmaker on the picket lines takes on significance when you realize that Frida has placed her dress front and center in this painting. In fact, many of the protesters walk underneath her dress as if the dress is watching over them. What's also significant is that there's an emphasis on Black and white workers united in their call for better wages, job security, and racial justice. I wondered if Frida had experienced any of the protests in the streets of New York in 1933. Did she have direct experience, or was she just an observer who was experiencing them by reading the newspaper? Well, I began to do some research. And what I discovered in this period of the early 30s is that the Communist Party of the United States was promoting unity between Black and white workers. Under the party's legal arm, called the International Labor Defense, they hired New York criminal defense attorney Samuel Leibowitz for the appeals of 9 African-American youths referred to as the Scottsboro Boys. These 9 youths, ranging in age from 19 to 12, had been unjustly accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train in Alabama toward the end of March in 1931. At their first trial, it was a hung jury, but Judge Hawkins declared a mistrial and sentenced 8 of the 9 to the electric chair. By November of 1932, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the convictions due to the Alabama court's failure to provide the youths with adequate legal counsel. It's at this point that Samuel Leibowitz takes over the cases. Now, in January of 1933, when the first appeals case for Haywood Patterson commenced, his chances of being found innocent were promising due to his new lawyer and one of the women, Ruby Bates, recanting her rape accusation. Yet, in April of 1933, once again, an all-white jury found Patterson guilty, sentencing him to death. On April 9th, an outraged public took to the streets in Harlem, and then again on April 25th, and on May Day in New York City's Union Square, and in Washington, D.C. on May 8th in 1933, led by Haywood Patterson's mother, Janie Patterson, seen here. Tensions were so high that the judge presiding over the remaining cases of the Scottsboro Boys was postponed. They were postponed. I soon realized that the high-profile Scottsboro case, combined with the Communist Party's sponsorship of legal services, of marches, of the signing and distributing of petitions to free the African-American youths, was an important part of Frida's experience while in the United States. She not only would have known about the call for racial and class justice through the newspapers, but she and her husband, muralist Diego Rivera, were caught up in the energy of protest. Diego had begun working on his mural for the new RCA building in Rockefeller Plaza on April 2nd. Frida wrote on the back of her painting, My Dress Hangs There, that she painted it while Diego was painting his Man at the Crossroads mural at Rockefeller Plaza. Both are creating then during this tense time, and both include images of protest and images of Black men. In Diego's mural on the lower left, seen over here, he shows workers carrying signs that read, "Work, want work, not charity," and "Divided we starve, united we eat." On the right over here, Diego emphasizes justice for all by including a soldier, a white worker, Vladimir Lenin, and a Black male worker. And they are all holding hands, seen much better here in this close-up. Diego took the Black man, reviled in American society, and made him a figure of unity in the communist Soviet Union. It would not be long before Diego's inclusion, though, of Lenin, seen here in the center, a Russian communist revolutionary and theorist, would be cause for controversy. On May 4th, Nelson Rockefeller asked Diego to remove Lenin's face from the mural, and Diego refused. Ultimately, Diego was paid in full, but asked to leave on May 9th, and the mural, which was close to completion, was ultimately destroyed. This prompted more protests in New York City, seen here. But before the protests of the destruction of Diego's murals came on May 17th, there were protests before that, because the Nazi book burnings occurred on May 10th. In 34 towns, university students throughout Germany threw their books by authors such as Brecht, Hemingway, and Helen Keller into fire pits to, quote, cleanse the German spirit, end quote. The American Jewish Congress had coordinated in advance huge nationwide demonstrations. A crowd estimated at 80 to 100,000 marched through the New York City streets for approximately 6 hours. You could say that New York City in 1933 was consumed with protest marches. Sound familiar? They were protesting the huge wealth gap in a capitalist system made more prominent by the economic depression, protesting the inequities of a racist legal system that guaranteed a Black man would be sentenced to death for raping a white woman, protesting the rise of Nazism with its anti-Semitic government policies and intensive propaganda program, protesting the suppression of the freedom of expression. After having a fuller understanding of this history, the newspaper clippings of marches collaged in the foreground of Frida's painting became much more than a generalized sign of the times. They made me feel the anguish, pain, frustration, and fear in this tumultuous period, as well as the elation of unity in the face of grave dangers and dire outcomes. In Frida's painting, Lady Liberty stands in the background. Mae West is standing here in the left middle ground. And in the foreground, we see Frida's Tewana dress hanging above the protesters. Perhaps Frida is saying that it's time for women to have real political and economic power. Frida's political painting and Diego's political mural were not isolated works of art that express such social and political issues. Frida was surrounded by artists who were galvanized by the Scottsboro legal battle that went on for years, such as we can see here in Hideo Noda's gouache Scottsboro Boys or Isamu Noguchi's sculpture Death. Now, Frida had seen the Jim Crow system of segregation firsthand when a year before she painted My Dress Hangs There, she stopped in Little Rock, Arkansas with her friend and fellow artist, Lucien Bloch. As the two were walking through the train station, they saw a sign that stated, quote, "for Negroes," indicating the separate area for boarding. According to Bloch's granddaughter, Lucienne Allen, quote, "Frida insisted my grandmother take this picture of her because they were both angered by such blatant racism," end quote. In Lucienne Bloch's journal, she wrote of this experience in 1932, quote, "It is like being in another world to see such outrageous medievalism." In 2008, this was a photograph I'd never seen before, and I'd never read anything about it. But it became one of several threads I pulled together to better understand Frida's experiences with racism while in the United States and her use of protest imagery in My Dress Hangs There, or to understand better her depiction of a beautiful African-American woman with an active gaze, as seen here in her portrait of Ava Frederick. Nothing of substance had been written about this portrait. I knew I had my work cut out for me. I also wanted to know more about Self-Portrait on the Borderline between Mexico and the United States, created in 1932 when Frida was in Detroit. It became the focal point of my talk at that conference I mentioned earlier. Like My Dress Hangs There, it's a complex painting with a lot of imagery to absorb. A smoke-belching Ford factory, high-rises, and machines occupying the right side, and the ruins of a pyramid, a crumbling wall, a skull, two ceramic figurines, flowers, and cacti occupying the left. In the middle on a border marker stands Frida with perfect posture. She wears a colonial-style floor-length pastel pink dress with fitted bodice. While it's easy to get lost in all the images in this painting, once again, details matter. This proper-looking young woman becomes a provocateur when you notice her tight-fitting bodice and nipples. Her obvious bralessness would have raised eyebrows among the Detroit area's upper crust. But Frida doesn't look ashamed. She stands tall as an independent Mexican woman, symbolized by the lit cigarette in one hand and the paper Mexican flag in the other. She also stands tall as a mestiza, a woman of mixed ethnicities, wearing a colonial-style dress and a beaded necklace bearing the colors of the Mexican flag. It's a hybrid outfit, and it's appropriate, as scholar Gloria Anzaldúa observes, quote, "The Mexico-United States border is a site where many different cultures touch each other, and the permeable, flexible, and ambiguous shifting grounds lend themselves to hybrid images," end quote. Frida plays up her hybridity through her outfit and her connection to both sides of the border. She also plays up her strong gaze. something she'd been perfecting as an adolescent, seen here on the left, wearing a man's suit. It's something that she will continue to perfect, as seen here in her self-portrait with necklace in the center, also created in Detroit and New York. And then something that she will continue to perfect with her self-portraits she becomes even more famous for in the 1940s, such as the one on the right, self-portrait dedicated to Dr. Ella Wessler. But in 2007, 2008, I had many unanswered questions about this painting, Self-Portrait on the Borderline between Mexico and the United States. I had questions in terms of symbolism, but also the context in which it was created. I wanted to know, what was Frida's experience of the Mexico-US border, especially given the anti-Mexican feeling and the forced deportation of approximately 1.8 million of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the 1930s. I also wanted to know, more about for example, the pyramid on the left. It shows two staircases, which to me reference the Mexica, better known as the Aztecs. Would she have known about the Aztecs at this point? And what about the flowers that she depicts? Did they have any symbolism? What about the American flag in the smoke going up? To me, it was going up in smoke, and yet it's in Ford Industries. How did she feel about Henry Ford and his River Rouge plant? What was happening with Ford workers around the time she was making this painting? I found out, for example, that on New Year's Day, 1933, Ford cut employees' wages for the second time in 3 years, prompting 9,000 workers to go on strike. A little over a month later, a reproduction of Frida's painting, Self-Portrait on the Borderline, was shown in the February Detroit News article, Wife of Master Mural Painter Gleefully Dabbles in Works of Art. While journalist Florence Davies belittles Frida's talent as an artist with her choice of words, gleefully dabbles, in the title, she conceded in the article that Frida's painting is by no means a joke, end quote. And this becomes apparent when comparing Frida's painting to another artist like Charles Sheeler, who created this painting called American Landscape. But in his painting, he clearly glorifies Ford's River Rouge factory. So in 2007, 2008, I still had so many unanswered questions. I also wanted to know more about a trip that Frida had taken from Detroit to Mexico by train with her American friend, Lucienne Bloch. They went in September of 1932, and they had many different experiences. And when they left on the trip, Frida had just begun Self-Portrait on the Borderline, and when she returned, she finished it. And so I wanted to know, what kind of experiences did she have after returning from that trip? Now, thankfully, I had Lucienne Bloch's insightful journal to provide many answers to this question and more. Now, in 2008, I continued working on my analysis of this painting for another symposium. This time, the symposium accompanied the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's 2008 Frida Kahlo exhibition. The theme of the symposium, an idea that Whitney Chadwick and I proposed to the museum, was to focus on the 3 US cities of San Francisco, Detroit, and New York. Whitney Chadwick discussed Frida in San Francisco, I discussed Frida in Detroit, and Hayden Herrera discussed Frida in New York. I felt as if I had come full circle from my early days of discovering Frida due to both Whitney Chadwick and Hayden Herrera. It was one of the high points of my career. I was also thrilled to meet and speak with art historian Victor Zamudio Taylor, artist Amalia Mesa Baines, and curator scholar Terry Romero. They had been symposium respondents, and the conversations with all three, both on stage and in private, made me realize that many of the questions I had about Frida's artistic sources and her creative development, both before coming to the United States and while she was here, didn't have clear answers, if any at all. I needed to conduct a lot more research. In the weeks after the symposium at SF MoMA, a feeling grew inside of me that I needed to write the book I wanted to read. I envisioned a book for a general audience, detailing Frida's personal and creative journey while living in the United States from 1930 to 1933. I wanted to write a story, not a scholarly essay or book, but a story that would be well researched and factual, yet written in a style that would allow readers to feel as if they were on this journey with Frida. As the documentary filmmaker Ken Burns put it, history is mostly story. For it is the great storytelling tradition found in most cultures and time periods that allows us to understand complex information in a manner that sticks because we feel something. Perhaps writer Maya Angelou says it best. I've learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. My hope is that this cross-cultural journey will inspire people to think about Frida in new and profound ways, to understand her more fully as a complex, brilliant woman who in her early 20s struggled to find her own voice as an artist in person, but who ultimately broke through to a signature style that she would build upon for the rest of her career. Now, I believe that Frida had everything inside of her that she needed to produce a major breakthrough in her art before coming to the United States. However, experiencing both her own personal trauma and the United States' political and social turmoil created a combustible energy that produced artworks such as Portrait of Luther Burbank, Henry Ford Hospital, My Birth, Self-Portrait on the Borderline between Mexico and the United States, and My Dress Hangs There. As one of Frida's favorite authors, D.H. Lawrence, said, all art partakes of the spirit of place in which it is produced. This place happened to be the United States, and so the word America in the title of my book references Frida's time in the United States of America. But because this is a story about a Mexican artist, it's an America seen through Frida's eyes. She brings a very different and complicated perspective to what we call in this country the American experience. For her, America is both the United States and Latin America. It is the problematic North American border relationship between Mexico and the United States. And it is the promise of Pan-Americanism, which was taken up by artists, intellectuals, and social activists in the 1930s, including Frida's husband, Diego Rivera. Now, Frida is an icon today, but in her role as a beloved icon, as scholar Margaret Lindauer has observed, quote, Kahlo became synonymous with a look rather than with her creative production, end quote. That is, Frida's look is more well known than the contents and interpretations of her paintings. To this end, in tracing her creative process, I wanted to look closely at the paintings. I thought it would be incredible if I could somehow discuss the paintings in a way that allowed readers to step into them as if they were rooms. Instead of looking at a work of art from a distance as one might in a gallery or museum, I thought if I could create a greater intimacy between Frida's paintings and readers, then people might gain a deeper understanding of her creative process and the multiple layers of her often profound works of art, layers that derive from hybrid images, Catholic, Aztec, colonial, modern, Mexican cultural traditions, subjects from the United States, etc. Likewise, in the epilogue, I wanted to give a sense of how the new breakthrough paintings created in the United States affected her later work. And so here we see in these images how the use of blood and red strings seen in Henry Ford Hospital, painted in the United States, become two symbols that she utilizes throughout her work later on. The red string here, but the blood. But now she starts to bring in the heart when she's in Mexico. And then, of course, in the two Fridas from 1939, we see that once again with the heart, the blood, and the strings or the arteries. And so I wrote then the prologue to emphasize the significance of blood, the heart, and Aztec traditions for Frida. And I'd like to actually end today's talk by reading my prologue. It begins with a quote. The Aztec sun god Huitzilopochtli threw a rebel's heart into Lake Texcoco and proclaimed, "When you see an eagle perched on a cactus holding a snake in its mouth, this is where you shall build your city." Frida was lying in a blood-soaked bed. Small creases in the white cotton sheets had absorbed the red liquid like the fruit of a prickly pear cactus sliced open. Glistening magenta, fruit of the earth, the blood miracle that consecrated the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, now surrounded Frida's naked body with the pain of death. The eagle and snake were missing in the dark early morning hours, but the sun still came up, casting light on Frida's dark, damp hair, covered with salty tears. She wailed in agony and despair. Diego, frantic, didn't know what to do. The blood, the screaming, it was all too much for him. He rushed into the living room, muttering something about the doctor. A call was made, but Frida would have to suffer for another hour before an ambulance arrived. At the Henry Ford Hospital, Frida, recumbent on a gurney, was whisked through a long, narrow cement hallway in the basement, her eyes fixed on what she perceived to be multicolored pipes on the ceiling. "Look, Diego, que precioso! How beautiful!" she exclaimed. This was the last bit of beauty Frida would encounter for a while. "We descend from death," Carlos Fuentes sings out. Death smiles, dances, and provides the sweet caresses of a lover. The skeletons of Jose Guadalupe Posada fill the imagination, especially during Day of the Dead celebrations, embracing Mexicans with their origins, holding on to Aztec times. "The past is always present," Fuentes whispers. "The heart, center of the human body, is the axis mundi. Keep the universe in motion," the Aztecs proclaimed. "Feed the gods." Blood was the cuisine the gods favored. Blood creates a line from the earthly to the divine, from death to life, from darkness to light. The duality of life for the Aztecs, as for Frida, was a bringing together of opposites. "Everything is all in one," Frida wrote. Seating these opposites side by side to share the blood of death and life, she painstakingly stitched them together with paint, one small stroke at a time. Blood and the concept of duality became central for Frida's art and life while living in the United States. She was a child of the Mexican Revolution, as she liked to say, a passionate defender of the underdog. But it took living in the United States, a place she'd longed to visit since her teenage years, to shake her foundations of home and homeland, forcing her to see a different reality. She struggled and stumbled in this foreign country, cursing it at times, embracing it at others, but always she visualized it with a keen eye for the humor that bubbled under the surface of pain. Frida loved life. It came through in her infectious, throaty laugh and in her direct manner of speaking. Even in English, sometimes she exaggerated her Mexican accent when necessary to spice up the conversation or punctuate a point. It came through in her way of dressing, whether she was wearing a man's suit or a colorful peasant-style pleated skirt and top. Details mattered. The right Aztec-inspired earrings, the perfect length cane, the precise size of jadeite beads, the best shade of lipstick. Everything was done with love. "Love is the only reason for living," she proclaimed. Fuentes said Frida was a, quote, natural pantheist, a woman and an artist involved in the glory of universal celebration, an explorer of the interrelatedness of all things, a priestess declaring everything created as sacred, end quote. When Frida came to the United States at 23 with her husband, muralist Diego Rivera, she was still at the beginning of this exploration with eyes wide open, seeing how all things were interrelated and integrating this universal celebration into her art. The young Frida was a novice painter. Her husband, on the other hand, was 44 and at the height of his creative powers. When Time magazine ran a short article on Diego's a year into Diego's stay in the United States, it referred to Frida as, quote, his pretty little Mexican wife, the former Frida Kahlo, end quote. Frida would always be physically petite, but her identity as Frida Kahlo, the great painter, grew in stature as she grew creatively and personally in the United States. Her first stop was San Francisco, a place she dreamt about for years. The day before Diego received the letter from the American architect Timothy Pfluger inviting him to paint a mural on the wall of his recently completed Pacific Stock Exchange building in San Francisco, Frida had her recurring dream. She saw herself waving goodbye to her family as she left her beloved Mexican homeland for San Francisco, the city of the world, as she called it. It amazed Diego that Frida's dream had been so prescient. Frida knew she had to start packing because she believed you had to, quote, protect what destiny has given you, end quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. That was a truly forceful, compelling, and inspiring talk on Kahlo, on place, her time in the United States, and her art. And as I said right at the very beginning, for those on the webinar who have not yet read the book, I would truly recommend it. And the book itself, dealing with this material, is filled with insight and on occasion verges into poetry, describing what Frida's and Diego Rivera's experiences were like in this 3-year period. So we have time for some questions and comments. And I'd like to start with a question from San Francisco about the time Frida Kahlo spent in the Bay Area. And you cover this in the book, but how might you summarize the most important changes to her personally and to her as an artist that occur during the time?
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear the end of your question because you froze up, but I think essentially you're asking what was the impact of living in San Francisco on her as a person and as an artist?
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. And I tried to give a little bit of that sense in my talk. But I would say, I guess first as a person, she, again, she loved San Francisco. She was just taken with the beauty of it. First off, she loved the water around her, the bay, the ocean. And one thing to keep in mind is that there was no Bay Bridge or Golden Gate Bridge. Right, we're so used to imagining it that way, but for her it was completely open, and so she loved that. She had great views of it. She particularly loved Chinatown. This is something she talks about a lot in letters to her family, particularly to her mother. And she said that she thought that Mexicans and the Mexicans and Chinese were one and the same. She just really felt that there was this deep connection between these two cultures. She was there in February for Chinese New Year. So she, heard the firecrackers. She saw all of the festivities, and she loved it. She said it reminded her of the fiestas in Mexico. She said the Chinese girls and women that she saw reminded her of the women in Mexico. Anyway, she just went on, and she even ended up purchasing some of the fabric in Chinatown and hired somebody in San Francisco to make her style of dresses and skirts, but using this material. So Chinatown seemed to have probably the biggest impact on her as a person. But interestingly, you don't necessarily see that in her art in San Francisco. But as an artist, I think the two things that I brought up are the ones that I would highlight again. So first, her interaction with women artists. I think that was so important for her, even though this was something that really hadn't been recognized before. And Frida says in one letter home to a friend that she didn't make any friends in San Francisco. But it's clear that working with these two women, Lucille Blanche and Pele Delap, was important for her because it allowed, as I said, a time for these women to just get together, have fun, certainly, but also to experiment with their art. And part of why this is important is that when you understand the history of art of this period, and you understand that women were typically not taken very seriously, to have this opportunity for these three women to be able to get together and explore in a way, and to, both take each other seriously, but not. I mean, they're having fun, but to explore in that way can be significant. And I think her interest in wanting to create something, the bloodiest thing you can think of. I also realized how, at first I thought, oh, this is just kind of funny, right? But then I realized, no, you know what? This is something that she develops with her portrait of Luther Burbank, and then continues to develop in her art. It really becomes central. And so here it is in San Francisco when I think she's first maybe thinking about it. I mean, she may have thought about it prior to San Francisco, but at least it's one of the first places where you see her verbalize it. And then it come into being in her work. And then certainly going to Luther Burbank's house and learning about him seemed to be very important for her. She called him a wise man. I think a lot of his ideas about hybridity, both in terms of plant life, but also humans, was of great interest to her. And I think that inspires her to create really her first major, I think, breakthrough in style, which is that portrait of Luther Burbank.
Here's a dimension of this, and this question is from Leonardo in Canada. What was the influence of Diego Rivera's art fundamental for Frida, or did she always keep her own style?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that you see in the beginning when she's starting out as an artist in the late 20s, after she's met Diego Rivera, uh, around 1928, 29, you're definitely seeing an influence from him, but other artists as well. It's not only him. She becomes involved with a group of artists who are meeting at the photographer Tina Modati's house in Mexico City. And all of these different artists are politically engaged, and they're really taking on this concept of Mexicanidad, right? Wanting to foreground this new notion of what it means to be Mexican in the post-revolutionary years. And so Frida too then starts to incorporate, images of indigenous women, like we saw in that painting, Two Women. There's another painting she creates of I think it's just called Indian Woman, she's topless. And so that was another, interest to sort of connect this idea of the indigenous woman to nature, right? And to try and find something that would be considered a true depiction of Mexico pre conquistadors, right? So going back to a time before Mexico had come under Spanish and French, etc., influence and rule. And so at that point, I would say, yes, of course, you can see, Diego's influence a bit there. But what's really, I think, important about Frida is she seemed to always have a real sense of her own style. So I would say her style of painting isn't, you don't look at it and you think, oh, she's clearly copying from Diego. But she's certainly taking on some of the subjects at that point. But by the time she's in San Francisco and she's exploring even more and beyond, really her connection to Diego, I think, becomes less and less. And he too even recognized that she was an artist with a unique perspective, and he often thought that she was a better artist than he was. And so I think that it's hard, when you are involved with somebody who is considered this great artist, it must be incredibly difficult to find your own voice as an artist. But I think that is one of the interesting things about Frida Kahlo, is that she was able to do that. And she was in a, I think a category all her own in that sense. She had a distinction. She has a distinction definitely from her husband. But one other thing I guess I would point out is one thing that I really discovered working on this book, though, was that they had what I call a visual dialogue. And I knew this when I started the book. What I didn't realize was how deep it was. And I started to just see all these connections between their works, at least in the United States, as they almost are having this visual dialogue as they move through the United States. So I think that that was important for them.
That's the visual dialogue dimension. I'd like to follow up for a moment. I have to admit, I'm from Detroit and have always been very closely involved with the city. And looking at several of the paintings that you had up and being familiar with them, in the borderline painting, that's the rouge plant in the background. That's the subject he's painting at the same time in the Detroit industry murals. And factories do show up in things she painted while she was in Detroit.
Mhm.
What's the flip side of that? Did she have a influence on what he was doing? He seemed to want her approval on his own art. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, I think that is a correct assessment. I mean, she's in Self Portrait on the Borderline, she's also incorporating these these images from Mexico. Like there's a figure from West Mexico of Nayarit that she's incorporating into the painting, and another one from Casas Grandes, and they're showing female figures who are connected again to this concept of like fertility, and fertility of the land. And that's something that Diego is certainly incorporating into that mural series at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And he does it with women. With he has these huge women of, he says, of different races around the murals, sort of framing them in some ways. But he also does have imagery as well coming out of um, Aztec culture, and also other cultures in Mexico. And so I think that there are some cases where I think he's seen Frida do something first and then he incorporates it. And then, sometimes she sees what he's doing and she incorporates it. If it's not always the exact same image, it's similar, right? And so they both also deal with, for example, the issue of life and death after, and like, well, I should say birth, life, and death after Frida has the miscarriage in 1932. And you see that in Frida's painting, My Birth, and also in a print called Frida in the Miscarriage. And then, Diego is also, incorporates those kind of images in the murals. Now, sometimes though, what I found interesting is that Diego often does emphasize this notion of woman as a symbol of, the fertility of the land.
Mhm.
But what Frida often does with her imagery is sometimes just the opposite. It's a woman having a miscarriage, a woman she's not showing a woman who's pregnant or is connected to this abundant fertility. It's a woman who's having a miscarriage. So, you also see these differences, and how Frida is always, I think, putting forth images of women that were quite radical at the time and are still radical, but you just didn't see these kinds of images at the time. In fact, when her painting, Henry Ford Hospital, was exhibited in 1938 in New York, a critic, he didn't get it. He didn't understand that showing a woman having a miscarriage was, again, radical, innovative art. He said it was, more of like something obstetrical, that didn't really belong in art. So, her vision wasn't really appreciated to the degree that it is today.
Well, very sadly, we're about out of time. I want to thank you for a very, very engaging conversation and talk. We very much look forward to having you back at Berkeley and to being in contact in future webinars. And we will send you some of the questions we couldn't get to. And if you have time to answer them, we will put them on our blog, and we have several that are really very compelling.
Okay.
So in conclusion, thank you, and I'd like to thank everyone at the Center for Latin American Studies for putting this together, and in particular, our interpreter, whom you may not have heard, but those who were listening in Spanish is superb. So we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here and the invitation. And thanks to all of you who asked questions.